Hello, everyone. It's exactly 6:30, and I want to welcome you to our second lecture in the Sarasota World Affairs Council series. I think most of you know me by now, Nat Coletta, president of this organization. Tonight we have a really special guest, Richard Fontaine, and I'm going to not belabor this moment while technology is all seemingly working to ask my program director, Lynn Partington, to actually introduce our speaker tonight. Let me just add that we're still on board for the return of Richard Skolnick, our health specialist, who will speak this time in December about the pandemic, past and present and future. So without further ado, let me introduce Lynn to introduce our speaker and say anything she would like in addition about our program. But I'm glad you're all with us. We have a really big audience, all online, over 100 people, which is really nice. And I appreciate your staying with us during these times.
You can go in.
Thanks, Nat. I want to welcome all of our SWAC members, our guests, and any post-election PTSD sufferers like myself. It has been a long, stressful year, and I think I can speak for everyone in saying that we'll be happy to see 2020 in the rearview mirror. But just because we can turn the calendar on December 31st, doesn't mean that all of our issues are going to be behind us and magically disappear. So we have a lot of issues that are coming up. First of all, the COVID virus, and hopefully you'll all tune in on December 7th when we have Richard Skolnick coming, who, interestingly enough, was our speaker last December and 1 full year ago. And he predicted that there would be very soon a pandemic. And everyone was very frightened, but little did we know how soon it was going to be coming. The good news is that it looks like there's some hope on the horizon for a vaccine, and we're all looking forward to that. But we have many other issues, and hopefully we're going to be covering some of those in our upcoming lectures. So if you can tune in on December 7th, we'll find out what Richard Skolnick has predicting for us in the future. Hopefully it's better news. And in January, we're going to be talking about, we have a lecture on peacekeeping. And Rick Barton's going to be here to be talking about conflict and creating a better peace in the world. And then we have Michael O'Hanlon from the Brookings Institute coming in February to talk about rebuilding our alliances with Europe. And so he will be here. And then in March, we are hoping and have our fingers crossed that we can have an in-person event outside at the beautiful Selby Gardens here in Sarasota. With that will certainly be a celebration if we can have it. And so we hope that everybody will continue to join in these lectures. And so tonight, one of the biggest issues that we're going to have to face in the new administration is China, our relationship with China, which has been a problem and an issue for all of us. So tonight we have Richard Fontaine, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for New American Security. Prior to that, he was a foreign policy advisor to Senator John McCain and worked at the State Department, the National Security Council, and on the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Prior to that, he served as Associate Director for Near Eastern Affairs at the National Security Council from 2003 to 2004. He also worked on Southeast Asian issues in the NSC's Asian Affairs Directorate. At the State Department, Mr. Fontaine worked in the Office of Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage and in the department's South Asia Bureau. Mr. Fontaine currently serves as Executive Director of the Trilateral Commission and has been an adjunct professor in the Security Studies program at George Washington University's School of Foreign Service. So I will, at this point, turn it over to Richard, and we're so happy to have you here because I think everyone is interested in what the path forward is going to be for the U.S. relationship with China.
All right, well, thanks for... I have to unmute myself. That's better. Thanks to all of you for having me. Can everybody hear me now? Are we good? All right, I'm seeing a little bit of nodding. So that's the hardest part is over if you can get the microphone set up right. But I'm very happy to be here. So thanks, Nat. Thanks, Lynn, for having me. I only regret that we have to do this virtually because Sarasota sounds pretty nice any time of year, but particularly right now, both weather-wise and you may be dimly aware that Washington, D.C. is a sporty environment given everything that's happening right now. But what I'm going to try to do tonight in the sort of lecture part of this presentation, and then of course in the Q&A we can take things in any direction you're interested in. But under this broad question of U.S. and China in an era of competition, I'm going to try tonight to answer three questions. One is, what has the pandemic done to U.S.-China relations? Because I think, as I'll argue, it has made some differences. The second question is, what is driving Chinese behavior and how is the world and the U.S. responding to it? And then the third is, are we in a new Cold War? One hears quite often that this is the new Cold War and we better get used to it and things like that. And I'll say that I think it's not a new Cold War. It's something quite different, but I'll try to explain why and what that actually means. So first on the pandemic, and if you think about it, and clearly the United States and China have many differences, whether it's issues related to human rights, or Taiwan, Hong Kong, Chinese activity in the South China Sea, trade, theft of intellectual property, you could go on and on and on. But fighting pandemic disease should have been the paradigmatic example of a joint cause that sort of brings the US and China together, that sort of produces some form of cooperation. This is almost like the metaphorical asteroid hitting the Earth. You know, neither the United States nor China has an interest in the virus spreading. Neither the United States nor China has an interest in economies being shut down because of it. We're all at risk as long as it sort of keeps going. And so you might assume from that this is actually one of the rare things that might bring the United States and China together. But of course, that has not at all been the case. And so instead of being an exception to great power competition, as we tend to call it here in Washington, it's rather become a feature of it. And part of that is based on the way that China's responded to the outbreak of the virus originally in Wuhan in China, and then covering that up for critical weeks. And then it rejected a team from the CDC that wanted to come in and sort of do some help and do some research. And then the Chinese Foreign Ministry came out and said, well, the United States isn't being helpful, and actually at one point said that maybe the virus actually started with Americans rather than with Chinese. Once it started to respond pretty effectively to the virus and get a handle on it, it started moving outward, touting its response and saying, hey, look, this is a top-down, we can build a hospital in a few days brand of autocracy, very different than the slow response in large and fractious democracies like the United States. And then it started to send aid through. So the Chinese aid arrived in every country in Africa, in many countries in Europe. There was the sight of European and other leaders sort of greeting Chinese planes on the tarmac as they would deliver medical supplies in a time of need. And this is at a very moment when the United States is trying to keep everything it can for itself because the virus was so widespread at home and the shortage of medical supplies was great and so forth. On the American side, the sense of competition that was heightened by the pandemic also took place, but for very different reasons. I mean, President Trump early on closed the borders to foreign nationals who had recently been to China. The officials in his administration privately expressed a total lack of trust in the Chinese government reporting on the number of cases. And, then they started calling it the China virus and things like this, the Wuhan virus. And then they started kind of looking with trepidation at the Chinese response, the claims of success at home, the Office of Aid to Other, and things like that. So what this has meant is that rather than dampening the sense of competition between the United States and China, what we've seen over the course of the pandemic in 2020 is actually a heightened sense of competition and one more vector, one more area in which competition is taking place. So over response to the coronavirus, over the narrative around it, around the vaccine and so forth. And of course, a backdrop for all this has been a turn toward hard-edge competition between the United States and China over more than a decade now. So following the 2008 global financial crisis, Chinese leaders, and this sort of coincided with the ascension of Xi Jinping to power in Beijing, seemed to really conclude that the Chinese time had come and the American time had passed, that it should increasingly kind of abandon its prior strategy of building economic strength while biding its time internationally, became more assertive. After Xi Jinping came in 2012, 2013, it militarized the South China Sea. It started this Belt and Road infrastructure initiative throughout Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and into the Middle East. It started using its economic might to try to kind of coerce governments throughout Asia, saw technological advantage over the United States and others. And in response to this, in something that I think has become one rare area of bipartisan agreement, the Trump administration elevated China as the #1 long-term security challenge of the United States. Both in the Bush administration and the Obama administration, there was a policy of engaging with China. You kind of hedge your bets on the side by building up alliances and other partnerships, but it was based on engagement and the idea that that would change behavior, diplomatic, economic, even military engagement would change Chinese behavior over time. It would make it a better actor on the world stage. It may even lead to liberalization and democratization at home. And that's really flipped now. And now both Republicans and Democrats tend to see China as the #1 challenge to U.S. national security. And even it's one set of areas where, for example, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer in the Congress will say on Trump's economic policies toward China, either, that's one area where they agree with him or he hasn't even gone far enough. And so this notion of competition and the fact that the pandemic sort of accentuated this has a couple implications. The first is what you'll often hear among people that hope to kind of balance the relationship is, well, it's ultimately a mixture of competition and cooperation. We'll compete over here on areas related to allies and partners and military issues and technology and economics, but we'll cooperate when it's in our interest to do so on global warming or global pandemics or non-proliferation or maybe North Korea. But in practice, that can be pretty hard because if you're so competitive in some spheres, it's hard to sort of hermetically seal those other issues. And the sort of spirit of competition almost infects this cooperative spirit. And it just makes it in practice very hard, even if there's kind of all else equal on interest in cooperation. And then the second kind of implication here is Chinese soft power. And so, the world as it's reacted over 2020 has really been kind of all over the place. So at the beginning, it was, China's responsible. This virus started in China. Then it was China put out the fire quickly and is providing aid and is stepping up where the United States and Europe are not. It's effective at home. It's generous abroad. And then on top of that, it was, China's unleashed its so-called wolf warrior diplomats. It's bullying countries. It's using its economic might, all these other kinds of things. And so the sentiment of Chinese sort of soft power has been kind of all over the place. So, that gets me, I guess, to, the second answer or the second question that I kind of, drew out, which is what does overall that Chinese behavior look like, and how has the world been reacting? And again, you can look over the course of 2020, and in foreign policy circles, there's always been this kind of idle debate. What does China really want, right? What if Beijing was handed a golden opportunity to strut on the world stage, absent a more powerful United States? Would it seize the opportunity? Would it act for the good of all? Would it convince the globe of its peaceful intentions? Or would it pursue a more cramped version and vision of its national interest? And more or less, the world has sort of inadvertently run that very experiment since January. It's been the combination of China's early coronavirus recovery, the catastrophic health and economic situation in the United States, the Trump administration, whose America First instincts turned it even more inward than it had been before, and a mostly kind of every country for itself response to the global pandemic. And that kind of gave China this golden opportunity to strut on the world stage, to sort of sketch out an agenda and an ambition, while the United States was so fiercely trying to kind of tend to the crisis at home. And my assessment is that Beijing essentially squandered the opportunity, and it did so in pretty dramatic fashion. The United States is not the only country in the world that has gone through worsening ties with China. In just the first half of this year, Britain, Japan, Australia, India, Canada, and others have been on the receiving end of the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy. It's named after this series of movies in China, popular series, Wolf Warriors, but, kind of bullying, use coercion, economic and diplomatic and other kind of things in order to kind of get your way and things like that. I mean, the bottom line is, if you're in a fight with Canada, you've done something wrong, I think. But it's not hard to like Canada. But even Canada has been on the receiving end of some of this. And if you look at what the specifics are that China's done to kind of raise the doubts and suspicions in some of these countries, it's a whole lot. So, over the summer, Beijing pursued a deadly border standoff with India that, crossed the so-called line of actual control, killed upwards of 24 Indian soldiers. It passed a national security law that effectively ended Hong Kong's political freedom, which in turn violated its internationally agreed commitments, even though it would claim it's just a domestic issue. The Australian government came out and expressed pretty mild support for an international inquiry into the origins of COVID. China responded by barring and taxing key agricultural imports, kind of, punishing them by stopping their imports of some stuff. Tokyo has reported that armed Chinese coast guards have sailed near the disputed Senkaku Islands virtually every day since April. And then, of course, Canada. Canada arrested at U.S. request a person who is high up in the Huawei company, and as a result, Beijing issued a travel advisory warning its citizens against traveling to Canada, saying, that Canada was subject to, quote, frequent violent actions that law enforcement was carried out. Again, we're talking Canada here. So, the Taiwanese are talking about seeing an unprecedented number of Air Force drills and live fire drills in the South China Sea carried out by China. I mean, even the Dutch, the Netherlands renamed its representative office in Taiwan. It shifted it from the Netherlands Trade and Investment Office to the Netherlands Office Taipei, which wouldn't seem to be a dramatic shift. But the Chinese didn't like the use of the term Taipei, and so they threatened to stop sending medical supplies and to boycott Dutch goods because of this. And so, it's this kind of, a lot of countries and officials around the world are saying, if this is what Chinese global leadership looks like, we've kind of had enough of it. We'd like to see a little bit less of it, maybe some more of the American stuff. And this is not just worrying, complaining, and sentiment. They're also acting. So, after Hong Kong, Britain responded by offering a path to citizenship for nearly 3 million Hong Kong residents. It suspended its extradition treaty. It had said that the telecom company Huawei could build out parts of the British 5G network. It reversed himself and said, no, it can't. India which is one of the most important markets for Chinese tech companies, banned almost 60 Chinese apps, including TikTok and WeChat. And now there's these calls in New Delhi to deny China contracts on infrastructure and things like that. Japan established a $2 billion fund for companies that want to shift their production out of China and back to Japan. Australia announced a significant increase in defense spending over the next decade, focused not incidentally on high-tech programs that can counter Chinese capabilities. And of course, the Trump administration announced its formal opposition to Beijing's claims of the South China Sea, sanctions on Chinese companies over human rights abuses in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, rescinded Hong Kong's special economic status, all this stuff. So when you back up from all this, you're seeing a China that is acting more and more assertively, and a world that includes the United States is reacting with policy moves that are at a minimum deepening this sense of competition between us and the Chinese. The last kind of question, I guess, is, well, what does this all amount to? I mean, is this a new Cold War? A lot of people say that's exactly what it is, including people that don't agree on anything else. The chief arms control negotiator for the Trump administration said, essentially, there was a Cold War, and said, we know how to win an arms race in a Cold War, and we know how to spin the adversary into oblivion. There's a camp of experts and foreign dignitaries that says a new Cold War with China is looming, but it'd be a mistake of historic proportions. We've got to avoid it at all costs. There's another that say, well, we're already in a Cold War, and we've got to focus on how to prevail. We enlist India as an ally, for example, or maybe we befriend Russia, or we do something else. Even the Chinese foreign minister has warned that, and of course he blames the United States, saying the United States is pushing us to the brink of a new Cold War. And then there's some Trump officials already say, well, this Cold War's already started. And when you look at this, it's tempting to reach for kind of the Cold War playbook. You've got two superpowers that are standing off in geopolitical, military, and ideological competition. They're competing for allies and influence across multiple regions. They both want to avoid getting into a hot war, given the profound destructiveness that would be involved with that. But neither one of them is willing to just acquiesce in the other's preferences. And so they're competing, and the competition stretches across multiple domains at the same time and indefinitely. And that certainly sounds familiar for anybody who either lived through or studied even a little bit about the U.S.-Soviet Cold War. But looking back to the Cold War, which tends to be a lot of what's going on right now, obscures actually more than it illuminates when it comes to U.S. China. The Soviet Union and the West, they formed coherent blocs. In Europe, for example, you had NATO on one side, you had Warsaw Pact on the other. You had non-aligned countries in strategic regions that were relatively few and far between, and the name of the game was to contain the expansion of the other side while finding new allies where you could. And then in these contested spaces, there were proxy wars and battles for alignment. And there was very little economic activity that took place between the blocs. The West traded essentially with the West, even though the West included non-Western countries. The sort of Eastern Bloc traded mostly with the Eastern Bloc. There was very little investment going back and forth and so forth. Almost none of those characteristics are present in the U.S.-China relationship. I mean, China lacks almost anything representing an Eastern Bloc. The United States has 5 treaty allies in the Indo-Pacific region, allies across Europe and NATO, and then sort of quasi-allies in other places. And China has North Korea and maybe Cambodia. It's somewhat disputed whether Cambodia is actually an ally. And so there really aren't coherent strategic blocs that way. And even to the degree the United States has a bloc, it's a military bloc. It's not an economic one. I mean, one of America's top trade partners is China, our greatest geopolitical rival. And what this means is that U.S. allies aren't ready to sign up for an all-out confrontation with Beijing. And nearly everybody wants some mixture of security and economic benefits from both the United States and from China. So what this kind of adds up to is, rather than seeing a replay of the Cold War, what we're seeing is a new kind of competition. It's not really conducive to these kind of neat concepts like containment or engagement or whatever that's defined America's previous approach to great power context. And you can't really apply these kind of cookie cutter Cold War policies like, you know, geographic containment or a counter-China military alliance or an Asian NATO or all-out economic warfare. You just can't really do those, nor is the answer the sort of fan fears of a looming Cold War and say, well, we've got to ease up on competition with China because we're afraid of what that might mean in terms of the Cold War. But the bottom line is Beijing's got these kind of increasingly global ambitions, and they're increasingly at odds with the United States. And so what the Americans need is an approach that sort of factors in this new reality. And what I think that ultimately comes down to is preparing for a long-term issue by issue competition with Beijing, where different countries are going to balance an array of relationships with both capitals. So you don't have, instead of unified blocks and uncoupled economies and standoffs in Europe, you're going to have kind of multiple strategies that are all aimed at decreasing the interdependence between the United States and China, and competing effectively where those things are necessary, but also kind of conserving our energy and resources where it's not. And so that's, you know, things like where China wants to export its high-tech system and be able to, you know, export its surveillance systems, we resist it. You know, where we want to try to prevent Chinese dominance in the South China Sea, we act differently. But then there's other areas where Chinese influence just actually doesn't matter that much to the United States, and we have to be able to set priorities there. And that ultimately the greatest measure of success in the U.S. China rivalry is going to be driven actually less from trying to diminish China and more from trying to augment America's power and standing and leadership in the world. Our domestic innovation, our you know, our allies and partners around the world, our military and economic strength, all of the kind of things that have been so important to making America a leading power in the world are the kinds of things that are sort of ripe for renewal now, and that in turn will make it more effective for us to compete with China. That is not to exclude areas where we can cooperate with China, even being, as I am, a little pessimistic about how possible that's going to be on stuff like climate change and non-proliferation. But we're about to see a new administration come in and probably a Republican Senate. And I think that, you know, the one foreign policy area where they are likely to agree and be willing to work together is on China policy and all the things that flow from that, the domestic, economic, and innovation and military agenda that goes along with it. And so in a strange way, for as rivalrous and competitive as the U.S.-China relationship is, it may be the one thing in Washington that can actually bring some Republicans and Democrats together in concerted effort. So anyway, a few thoughts to open up our discussion, and I'd be happy to answer any questions or hear any comments that you might have.
Well, thank you, Richard, very much for that analysis. And we already have a huge lineup of questions for you. So let me get right into them because we have a very active audience here. So this is from Mary Palermo. Do you see Biden working to restore negotiations? Certainly Biden will get rid of tariffs.
Well, I think restore negotiations is not exactly the way to think about it, because the negotiations with China have continued until today. I mean, I was at an event with Bob Lighthizer, the U.S. Trade Representative, and you know, they've postponed the biggest negotiations on a second trade deal pending the results of the election. But the Chinese are willing to negotiate. The Trump administration was negotiating with them, and I think the Biden administration will talk or negotiate with them as well. The question is, what, if anything, the Biden administration gets for eliminating the tariffs. These are tariffs that the Biden administration, had it been in power, would not have put into place. And certainly not put into place for the reasons the Trump administration did, which was largely focused on reducing the trade deficit. But nevertheless, those tariffs are in place. And where the Biden administration had come in and just sort of give those away for free, that would set a tone for how the Chinese will think about dealing with the Biden administration going forward. And so the administration will come in with some inherited leverage that the tariffs carry, but a little bit of an uncomfortable situation, and that leverage would not have been leverage they would have generated had they had the choice. And so they will have a question about, and all they've said so far is that they'll review the tariffs, which, when in government, you're not sure what you're going to do. You say you're going to review things. And so that's what they're going to do. And they're going to have to say which tariffs are going to stay, which ones they want to get rid of. And for the ones that want to get rid of, do they want to extract something from the Chinese? And there are a whole bunch of things that they could usefully extract. For example, on the theft of intellectual property through cyber means, which is back to levels off the chart, which it was until there was an implicit deal worked out with the Chinese during the Biden administration. So the specifics of that remain to be seen.
Thanks for that, Richard. Now, Carol Lou Marquette would like to know whether Russia would be considered an ally or a quasi-ally of China.
Yeah, I wouldn't consider them either of those, at least not yet. But they certainly are increasingly aligning. Over the years, there's been a lot that has driven the Chinese and the Russians apart, including regional rivalry and all kinds of other things, including relationships with the United States. But over the last few years, they have moved from being kind of the party of no in international organizations. It used to be the case, for example, at the UN Security Council, that whenever there was a tough vote, China loved to abstain. And so the Russians, if it was an American thing, the Russians would veto, and then the Chinese would kind of get cover from the Russians doing that and get into that slipstream, and then they would abstain. But the effect would be to frustrate whatever resolution, whatever it was the United States was trying to do. And then it's moved to the Chinese are happy to veto along with the Russians. And now sometimes it'll be the Chinese will veto first, and then maybe the Russians do, or they abstain or something like that. And so the Chinese are sort of bolder in their opposition to American designs in some key international fora. But they often, they've moved from having, I would say, kind of an exclusively negative agenda. So they could agree that they don't want to see a world dominated by the United States. They don't want to see governments overthrown, whether it's by force in countries like Libya or Iraq, or through popular democratic revolutions like the revolutions that, either the first incarnation of the Arab Spring or the so-called color revolutions in Eastern Europe. They don't want to see those things. They could agree that they want to keep sovereignty from the redefinition. So they could agree to resist kind of what they saw as an American overreaching agenda. But they didn't really have much in the way of a positive agenda. They're increasingly moving toward having something approaching a positive agenda. I mean, they have a bigger trade relationship now. Russia's selling its gas to China more out of necessity than anything else because of the sanctions on Russia for a discounted price. They've done joint exercises. Their navies have done joint exercises in the South China Sea, and things like that. And you can kind of look around, and there's sort of flickers of active cooperation in various areas. It's sort of hard to know exactly how much to make of all this, but it is different, and it is augmented compared to where it used to be. I wouldn't say it constitutes, an alliance or a quasi-alliance, but they're headed in the direction of greater alignment.
Okay, here's a question from a colleague of mine at New College, Barbara Hicks, a professor of international studies there. With the new Asian Free Trade Pact signed, including China, and the U.S. having torpedoed the TPP chance to counterbalance China economic power, does the U.S. have another viable option to maintain equal economic power in the region?
No, not really. I guess I would distinguish between economic power as kind of an absolute thing. I mean, the United States has still got the biggest economy in the world. And, that's a lot of economic power, although China is, the number one trade partner of, a number of countries in the Indo-Pacific, whereas that was not the case even a few years ago. But more than power, I think maybe the right word is economic leadership. And, the reality right now is that you have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was an American idea cooked up. And you have RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which was cooked up by the Southeast Asian countries, but that includes China. And those are the two big multilateral Asian trade deals. And the United States is party to neither of them, nor is the United States offering any alternative. So we're, unless we change our posture on that, we're fairly irrelevant to trade deals in Asia. And for anybody who's ever worked on Asia policy, you'll know that trade policy is foreign policy in Asia. So, it goes beyond just, what are your tariffs going to be on beef imports or something? It's a signal of presence and relevance and strategic intent. And right now, U.S. just isn't in the game. I hope that we'll get back in the game, but I can't say that I'm terribly optimistic. I mean, Joe Biden was the person at the end of the Obama administration who was designated to sell the Trans-Pacific Partnership to our allies and on Capitol Hill. Didn't work, and he has since backed away from it. The domestic politics of trade are just not terribly favorable for free traders these days.
So this actually next question follows on that in a way. Robert Anderson asks, was it a mistake for the U.S. to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership? Can we fix that?
Yes and yes. It was a mistake, and we could fix it by getting back in it. Question, but again, I don't have to get elected to anything. So it's fine for me to say that. It's fine on policy grounds. It's a no-brainer. It would, the studies of this show that on economic grounds alone, it would be modest, but a net addition to economic growth and prosperity in the United States. I mean, take one example. The tariffs on imports of U.S. beef to Japan are about 26%. For everybody else in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it's about 5%. And if we were in, it'd be 5%. But for our farmers, it's 26%. So would you rather have 26% tariffs or 5% tariffs? And we're supposed to be helping the farmers, and this is an important part of America and all this other stuff. Well, this hurts the farmers, not helps them. And that's just one example. I mean, trade barriers are bad for our exporters. Trade barriers increase prices. And then also just again, as sort of a signal of strategic intent, a signal of relevance, a signal of foreign policy presence and engagement. Countries are looking relatively nervously at this juggernaut that is China, and they like to think that there's at least another kind of more benign juggernaut out there that's also engaged called America. And when they see us not in the economic game, they wonder whether we are. You add that to the inward lookingness of the past few years, and particularly in 2020, and they say, okay, well, the United States has got a coronavirus pandemic that's raging out of control, and it doesn't seem to be able to do anything about it. It's got a president who says his foreign policy stems from America first and thinks its allies screw him rather than help him. He has this kind of withdrawal mindedness. He's confrontational with China, and yet they don't want to get involved in any of the kind of multilateral economic efforts that are going on in the region. What does that leave? Well, it leaves the military strength of the United States, where we are getting involved in lots of multilateral things. We are solidifying security partnerships. We do have a very large defense budget, but we don't just want to be the security protector of our friends in Asia. We are a Pacific power, and we want to help balance power in Asia, not just be the cop there. And so I think, it's a mistake to pull out. It would be good to go back in. I mean, but the $1 million question is there a way to do that that's politically acceptable to the Congress? That this thing, the TPP, has got to be approved by the Congress. And, Obama wanted to do it at the end of 2016, but it wasn't going to get passed by the Congress. And I will remind you that this was not just a Trump thing at all. In 2016, the two final candidates on both sides, Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, Ted Cruz, and Donald Trump, all said that if elected, they would pull out of TPP. And Biden has said, well, I wouldn't pursue it in its current form. Aha! Well, there's a little bit of a promise there, you know, in its current form. Can we hang our hat on in its current form? All right, well, how about some other slightly modified form? You know, it would require them to renegotiate things. They all said they wouldn't do it. But hey, look, if that's the price of getting America involved, let's give it a shot, right? So what is the stuff? What are the changes, if any, that would have to be made in order to get back into it for the United States? Unclear. It's also unclear whether a Biden administration will come in and actually have trade as a priority. And, you know, the Obama administration basically appointed a caretaker as U.S. trade representative and said, oh, we'll do all the hard trade stuff in the second term when we don't have to face re-election because it's politically sensitive. And they did TPP and they started talking about a free trade agreement with Europe and things like that. But the first term was kind of silencio. And if the Biden administration comes in like that, then you're not going to say anything. I hope it doesn't. I hope it comes in with something ambitious and then tries to work out something that's politically acceptable, but I don't know.
Okay, Richard, the questions keep rolling in. If you need to take a sip of water or something.
I'm good if you guys are good.
Okay, Carolou Marquette is asking, what is the role of the artificial islands that China has constructed in the South China Sea? And how should the U.S. deal with it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's two problems with those islands. And just by way of background, so China had claims as its sovereign waters and territory almost the entirety of the South China Sea, some of which is 1,000 miles from the Chinese shoreline. And there are certain features in these, you know, that's what they call them in the biz, these features, these little rocks, some of them are covered up when the water's high and are exposed when the water is low and things like that. And so, you know, back in the Obama administration, you could sort of look down and sail around and see what's going on. And it looked like China was building up these features. So something that was a couple of rocks suddenly was, they were dredging and they're putting land there. And, you know, then there suddenly was you know, they're putting runways on there and they were putting buildings on there and things like that. Well, it's starting to look, you know, a little suspicious. And so Xi Jinping came to Washington and Obama confronted him, and Xi Jinping made a solemn commitment. China will not militarize the South China Sea, will not militarize those features. All right, well, fast forward not very far. And suddenly what appears? Well, there's warplanes on those runways, and there's Navy ships stopping at those islands, and there's PLA, People's Liberation Army troops on these islands, and there's things that look like radars on these islands, and there may be things that look like missiles and things like that. So that's kind of where we are. And there's two problems. And people focus, in my opinion, way too much on the first and not at all on the second, because we don't have a good answer for the second. The first one is freedom of navigation. I forget the number, but I don't know, 60% or something. Some very large percentage of global trade travels through the South China Sea on these container ships or oil tankers or whatever. And obviously all countries, and especially the United States, which is imports and exports a whole lot, has a strong interest in not seeing any disruption to the free flow of navigation, free flow of commerce in the South China Sea. So the U.S. Navy does freedom of navigation exercises where China will say, U.S. Navy, you can't come in, this is our territorial waters. And the U.S. Navy says, we're doing it anyway because we're going to show and we're going to demonstrate that we've got freedom of navigation. These are actually international waters and you're not going to stop us. So they do that pretty regularly. They do overflights, things like that. And that's about what you can do if you're worried about freedom of navigation. But I actually think the chances that China's just going to somehow shut off the South China Sea to commercial shipping is highly unlikely. I mean, maybe in an all-out war, but if we're in an all-out war, we got bigger problems than commerce flowing through the South China Sea. The other issue is military. So China is, it's just you know, the United States has aircraft carrier strike groups that sort of travel around the world. And when we want to project power far from our shores, we have carriers there, and we've got warplanes that fly off those carriers, and they can bomb places, and they can do things. Well, China, until very recently, didn't have any aircraft carriers. Now it's got two. Unclear exactly how effective those things are. but they've got these almost stationary aircraft carriers by militarizing these features in the South China Sea. So this, you've got runways down there. You can put surface-to-air missiles down there. You can put surface-to-surface missiles down there. You can put fighter jets down there. You can put bomber jets down there. You can use those to, in other words, project power 1,000 miles further than you would if you were just using what you had in your sovereign territory within the confines of China itself. And, one, that is an issue clearly if there's ever a war, whether it involves the United States or some country in Southeast Asia. But also it creates a certain level of political coercion. If you're Vietnam, for example, and China demands something of you, it's a different thing if you think those islands are aimed at you not that far away, as opposed to China, way up there with a land border, and so it creates a sense, well, it projects power, which is part of the whole thing. One of the reasons why I don't focus very much on this is because nobody's got a great answer to it. I mean, we can look at those islands with satellites. We can sail around those islands in freedom of navigation exercises. We could fly over those islands and show that we can do that. Unless you send the U.S. Marines on those islands, the Chinese are not coming off of those islands, and so they're there. And what do you kind of do with them? So that's really the issue in the artificial islands in the South China Sea.
Okay, let's keep moving. The questions keep coming in. This is Lee Bushler. Should we be analyzing the idea of Cold War in the context of cyber warfare rather than kinetic assets and maybe even alliances?
Yeah, I mean, cyber warfare is kind of this in-between thing where it's not cold in the sense that it can have real effects, but it doesn't feel like hot war where you're shooting at each other, and it's this kind of in-between sort of thing. So so when does a cyber attack amount to an act of war? Well, according to U.S. government definitions, it is when the cyber attack has effects equivalent to that we would consider war if carried out by kinetic means. Well, okay. I mean, so the idea would be, and even that's problematic, right? I mean, the idea would be if we would see equivalently an attack on a hospital with a missile as a cyber attack that shut down the electricity, and the same number of people died because the electricity was shut off at the hospital, even though it doesn't feel the same. But that's the definition. The reality is that much of the, whatever you want to call it, competition, conflict between the United States and China is being carried out through cyber means. Everything from China attempting to influence, if not interfere, in the domestic political system in the United States, to the theft of intellectual property, to the hacking of any institution or individuals associated with the national security community. I mean, I, like many others, got a nice love note from the Office of Personnel Management a few years ago saying that my personnel file, that when I had been granted my security clearance, had been stolen in its entirety by China, and they offered me a year of free identity protection, online identity, to make up for it. Well, okay, well, thanks. But they stole millions of records. So espionage, theft of intellectual property, interference in political affairs, spreading of disinformation, and the probing of different systems. Because if you're going to launch an attack, then you often have to implant a beacon in the system that you wish to attack. And so there's constant mapping of American systems and implantation of beacons, including in so-called SCADA systems, these systems that run industrial control systems, basically things related to water infrastructure, things like that. And this is like all day long. And so we're going back and forth with the Chinese in this kind of cat and mouse all day long. And we certainly haven't seen the worst manifestations of what that could look like. But it's I think it's only you're only going to see the activity increase. And in part, it's because the costs of doing so are so low. I mean, if you want to try to harm the political system, the economy, the society, the whatever of an adversary, cyber means can get you a whole lot pretty cheaply, and at least has some plausible deniability, because you can always say that, as President Trump said, it was some 300-pound guy on his bed in the basement or whatever, rather than, experts with, who are affiliated with a particular government.
So here's a rather direct question by Kathy Kelly. Have the tariffs actually reduced the trade deficit?
No.
From Lee.
Oh, sorry. Do you want me to elaborate?
I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, yeah. So there's two points here. One, no, they haven't, and two, even if they did, that's not a good objective. It is wrong to measure the health of a bilateral economic relationship by reference to the trade deficit. President Trump, this is a core belief of his, that if you have a trade deficit with the United States, if the U.S. has a trade deficit with a country, that's bad. And if we have a trade surplus with that country, it's good. And that the bigger the trade deficit, the worse it is. And that if China has a trade deficit of X billions of dollars, that means they stole that money from the United States and the jobs that go along with it, and they owe it back. And the problem with that is that that's untrue, and that's not how it works. I mean, what happens is that, capital flows in a direction and goods flow in a direction. I mean, when we have a trade deficit with China, we get goods and services from China. And so we may export less goods and services to China, but there may or may not be good reasons for that. I mean, I have a trade deficit with the grocery store up the street because when I get goods from them, I don't go and stock the shelves afterwards and provide direct services or give them something I grew in my backyard. I give them money for those things. So I have a permanent trade deficit with the grocery store, but that works in my favor. And so it's both hasn't worked even on its own terms, and even if it had, it would have been a bad idea. There are other much worthier objectives if you're going to take coercive economic measures against China, including tariffs, which include the theft of intellectual property and forced technology transfer and unfair investment rules applied to U.S. companies and possibly subsidies to state-owned enterprises. Those are the kinds of things that are much more serious. They're also hard as hell to go after because those are structural features of the Chinese economy. I mean, they're not going to just turn around and stop subsidizing state-owned enterprises and things like that. But those are the real grievances.
Okay, Virginia Hitchcock would like to know, what is the present situation of U.S. and Chinese journalists who have been caught in the middle of the struggle?
Well, they've been kicked out. And well, I take that back. So the Chinese journalists, what the Trump administration did was there are certain state-owned Chinese media companies that were in the United States and essentially registered just kind of as independent media outlets. And they required them to re-register as basically state propaganda or state mouthpieces. And that's true, they are. I mean, there is not freedom of the press in China. And their media is all either state-owned or state-influenced, or state-censored or state whatever. The Chinese didn't like that and said that was unfair, and that under the principle of reciprocity, you make life difficult for our guys, we're going to throw out some of your guys. And so they sent people packing from the Wall Street Journal and some other newspapers, actually including Australian reporters and otherwise, and rescinded their visas so they couldn't stay. And so they've left the country. So now I think there's the smallest American media presence in China that there's been in a very long time.
Okay, the questions keep pouring in, Richard. I hope you're up to it.
I'm doing my best. You can tell me if if I look like I'm starting to flag or whatever.
Not yet. Okay, Lisa Sabata asks, heterodox economists like Stephanie Kelton and Bill Mitchell argue that the U.S. Treasury deficit spending is okay as long as real resources exist and inflation is controlled. They also propose policies like a Green New Deal and a federal job guarantee. Do you agree or disagree that this domestic fiscal and monetary activity would make us competitive and in a more fortified position with China?
That's an interesting question. Well, actually, I think it's kind of more than one question wrapped up in there. Part of it turns on, I don't know these two economists. If it's getting at so-called modern monetary theory, then I do not agree with that. That is the idea that a quasi-independent Fed, a central bank, shouldn't control the money supply, should be controlled by Congress. It could sort of open the monetary spigots when it wants to for good social ends. I think that's a way to debase your currency real fast and inject politics into something that we, judiciously try to protect against that. But that's wholly different than fiscal policy, where the government's spending money, borrowing money and spending that money, which is what we're doing now to the tune of trillions of dollars. And that, whether that's a good idea or not, turns on what you're going to spend it on, how high the interest rates are. So right now, I mean, the economy, the U.S. economy starting to come back into action, but it's been in a medically induced coma ever since the shutdown started and demand has dropped and people couldn't go to work and things like that. The single best thing the U.S. government can do is borrow money at extraordinarily low interest rates and then pump that into the economy through some of the programs they had earlier this year, like the PPP loan program that kept small businesses afloat and gave them a bridge that otherwise they might have gone out of business. Because what we want is when we come out of this thing and demand and the supply of labor go back up, that the economy can revive, rather than when demand goes up, businesses couldn't survive and we have a much longer transition period to full employment because businesses that the government could have kept afloat were not able to be kept afloat. And so on the fiscal side, I think deficit spending at a time like now is wholly warranted. The problem that we tend to have as a country is we also do deficit spending when it's not warranted. So we do deficit spending in the good times and we do deficit spending in the bad times. And that's when you get yourself into trouble. And so I would say, yes, deficit spend now, but we shouldn't have been deficit spending for as long as we have. But Americans like low taxes and lots of government services. And that's like, there's only one way to do that, and that's to borrow the money. And that's what deficit spending is. The federal job guarantee, I guess I would have to see what these guys mean by a federal job guarantee. But I have again, if you're trying to, in an emergency situation, save people from spending their time at food banks and keep them afloat temporarily while we're in the worst depression since the Great Depression, that's one thing. But just as a general federal job guarantee, where if you have no job, you can work for the government, I just don't think it's going to fly in the United States. So I don't know. That's probably a partial answer to that. And ultimately, what is going to make us most competitive with China, in my view, is to double down not on the areas where China is strong, but the areas where we're strong. And we run into this problem a lot, actually, because the initial reaction to China's sort of growing in strength and wealth is to out-China China. So China's got, a list of the top technologies it wants to dominate, including through lots of government investments. So AI and quantum computing and gene editing and things. So like, where's our list? Where's the American list? And how many billions do we need to throw of government money into that? Or, the Chinese have a One Belt, One Road infrastructure aid program. So where's our One Belt, One Road program? Or, you can sort of go through, and the answer is not that. The answer is to be a better version of America, to double down on the things that help build, so if you look at our kind of industrial base and our tech sector, it's been there's been government funding for basic R&D and things like that, but it's also the venture capital ecosystem, the research universities, the ability to scale up businesses, H-1B visas that bring lots of talent here and things like that. It's a much different model that has succeeded. And so in my mind, let's double down on the model where we've succeeded rather than trying to adopt some model that Chinese have put into place.
Okay, the next question circles back to cyber warfare. Barbara Hicks asks, has the U.S. raised its capability to counter these cyber attacks, including specific knowledge of Chinese actors and passive entry?
Over the years, yeah, sure. A lot of this stuff is way behind the scenes. A lot of the information is classified. So it's always hard to get into specifics or even sometimes tell specifically what kind of knowledge is inside the U.S. government and what kind of operations have taken place. But there are a lot, and I mean in the thousands and thousands and thousands of people in the U.S. government that are focused on cyber capabilities at U.S. Cyber Command, at the National Security Agency, at the CIA, within the military services, on and on. And it would be malpractice if they were not focused on the most active actor in cyberspace in the world.
Okay, well, I would be remiss if I didn't raise this question from Robert Partington, the son of our program director, who's actually working with Apple. Are China and the U.S. engaged in an AI race? And is the U.S. in danger of falling behind?
I would say yes and yes. I mean, the characterization of China on AI and on other high technology issues, even until a couple of years ago, was this notion that, the Chinese are great at replicating and maybe simplifying and making cheaper the kind of tech developments that have taken place in a place like the United States or other places, but they couldn't really innovate on their own. And I really think that if that was ever true, it's really gone out the window. Some of the breakthroughs that are happening in AI and on other technologies are happening in China. But to say kind of AI generally only takes you so far, because AI is machine learning as a kind of a general phenomenon, but you have to kind of get specific into AI as applied to what are these specific applications that you would want to and technologies that you would want to preserve. And is it bad for China to be ahead or is it bad for China to move ahead on AI if that brings about medical developments from which we can all benefit? No. Is it bad if that AI makes it easier to find U.S. aircraft carriers and target them? Yeah. So some of this is in the what is it you're talking about. But a lot of the U.S. defense policy now is focused, as opposed to operations in the greater Middle East and counterterrorism and things like that, on competition and deterring conflict and prevailing in conflict if necessary with China, and seeing as the sort of top advantage the United States military has in that competition is technological. And that gap, which includes AI, and that gap between the United States and China is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. So there's a dedicated effort to stop the shrinking and expand it back out so the United States has technological dominance. And that's where a lot of the resources and time and attention are going right now.
Okay.
So J. Michael Dow wants to know, what about TikTok? Thoughts?
To be totally honest, it's hard for me to know what about TikTok because for a few reasons. One is, the Trump administration really took it on and said, we're going to ban TikTok, or we're going to try to force a sale. And if we don't have a sale, we're going to ban TikTok. India banned TikTok. But, I know I don't know, I have 4 kids. I know a lot of kids on TikTok. And I'm trying to determine precisely what the harm is. And to my knowledge, the administration hasn't, or the risk of harm hasn't really specified what the harm is. I mean, one harm could be that personal data traveling that is on or hosted on the TikTok app travels to servers that are owned by TikTok, which is based in China. And under the Chinese cybersecurity law, Chinese companies must, at government request, provide data to the government of China, including the security services. So maybe there's a risk that, you know, your kid's video of dancing in front of the refrigerator is going to be supplied to the government of China, which may have a creepiness factor, but it's not clear that's sort of a national security harm that rises the level of, you know, the Chinese stealing my entire security clearance, you know, dossier, along with 10 million other American government folks. But another is that this could be used to propagandize, right? So now, you know, all these apps run on ads, and, you know, one, it's an ad, you should buy this, you know, Pop-Tart or whatever, but, you know, down the line, it's going to be, you know, Xi Jinping is a glorious leader and you should join us, or, you know, whatever. That's a very different kind of threat, and one that we would be, you know, more attuned to. It would be more kind of obvious to us. So given that the particular, and then the other question, and this is the question not just for TikTok but for everything else, is between the binary choices of, is it okay or do you try to ban it? Is there a middle thing where you can mitigate the risk of harm, which means you got to specify the harm, and you got to figure out what that risk actually amounts to, and then what you're willing to pay, either literally or sort of, you know, metaphorically, in order to mitigate that risk. And maybe I've missed it all, but I just haven't seen that, like, you know, laid out by really anybody. And I haven't done it myself. So I don't know, maybe you guys have a better informed, or at least stronger conviction about TikTok, but that's, I don't know. I know people, including people I respect a lot, who are very solid on China issues, that think that TikTok is a clear and present danger. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, Robert Partington is back on with tariffs. Would you agree that Trump's tariffs have reinforced rather than successfully addressed structural concerns regarding the Chinese economy for the rest of the world? By strengthening the role of its SOEs, what is the alternative? State-owned enterprises.
I don't know if it's strengthened or whether it's reinforced the structural concerns, but it doesn't seem to have diminished them at all, which, according to the administration, was going to be left to phase 2 of the trade deal. So they wanted to go for everything. They wanted to go for reduce the trade deficit, buy more soybeans, buy more autos, buy more goods that are made and grown, particularly in electoral swing states ahead of the 2020 election. And they wanted some assurances on theft of intellectual property. And then they wanted to tackle state-owned enterprises and their subsidies, investment rules. You can kind of go on and on. And there was no way they were going to get all that. And so they prioritized the trade deficit and commitments by China to buy a certain amount of American goods, weighted toward goods that are made and grown in electoral swing states, or that are part of the president's base, like farmers and soybeans in the Midwest and things like that. The Chinese didn't even fulfill those commitments. And so not only is there no phase 2 deal that was supposed to deal with those structural issues, they didn't even get full satisfaction on the phase 1 trade deal, which is about the trade deficit. And so I don't know whether it's worse than it was or whatever, but it certainly doesn't seem to be better. And I think it's going to be really hard, because structural issues are structural. I mean, it's one thing to say, all right, you got us, we'll buy more of your soybeans, or you got us, we'll let more of your cars into the Chinese market. It's another to say the structure of your economy has to change as sort of our demands. I'd love to see that. I just don't know if that's going to happen in any kind of reasonable time frame. And it's a good question. What is the alternative? I mean, there's alternatives of, I mean, at a minimum, I think the alternative is to reprioritize. So you're never going to get everything. And in the relationship with China, they'll listen to issue number 1 and usually react. They'll listen less to issue number 2 on your priority list, even less to issue 3. And by 4, they're not really listening anymore, because I think, it's just a laundry list of issues or grievances. And you could pick 15 different issues that you want to get satisfaction from in the U.S. China relationship. You could pick Taiwan, you could pick the Uyghurs and human rights in Hong Kong, you could pick the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, you could pick Hong Kong, you could pick relations with India, you could pick cyber theft, you could pick trade debt. I mean, you could go on and on and on. So the question is ultimately, what is number 1? And in the Obama administration, they made number 1 theft of intellectual property through cyber means. And Xi Jinping made a commitment and said, I'm paraphrasing, we don't do it and we'll never do it again. And a lot of people, including me, were very skeptical that this is going to have any real sort of purchase. And yet the scale of this stuff dropped by about 50%. And then when the Trump administration came in, that was not their number 1 priority. It was a priority, but it wasn't number 1. It probably wasn't 2 or even 3. They wanted, help on North Korea. They wanted trade deficit. And so it spiked right back up to where it was. But they did get some help on North Korea, and they did get at least movement on some of these purchases. They didn't get the whole enchilada, what they wanted. But I think I guess the point here is that you can, through carrots and sticks and negotiation, a lot of times you can get what you want, or at least something approaching what you want with China on issues number 1 or 2. But after that, it's going out the window. So the alternative is to reprioritize. And we've got to decide what is the stuff that's most important to us. Not what is all we want, but what's the most important to us in the China relationship, and what are we willing to put in order to get that? And also how realistic it is. I mean, obviously some issues are, like I was saying before, some issues are harder than others for the Chinese to do.
Okay, your negotiating skills are coming out.
That
Lee Butchler wants to know, are we experiencing a brain drain that's benefiting China? And if so, what do we do about it?
I mean, there's fewer people. Well, I would say no, we're not experiencing a brain drain, but we could. I mean, China is experiencing a brain drain. In 2019, 3 million Chinese emigrated from China, which, in a population of 1.5 billion sounds like, a rounding error. But guess what 3 million it is? It's those with the education and the means and everything to emigrate to another country oftentimes. And so, and because of the corruption crackdown and people moved their assets offshore, wealthy families bought property in other countries as a contingency. They tried to move. And so this is a perfect example in my mind of where we should double down on American strength, which is so different than what China would or even could do. So a friend of mine works in MIT's artificial intelligence PhD program. And I don't know how many Chinese students they have, but it's a fair number. And he said to a person, those students would like to stay in the United States after they get their PhD. Because you make more money in the United States, they already speak English, it's freer, and the air quality is better, among other things, than if you go back to some of these places. But nobody can, because we say, well, we don't want those foreigners coming in and taking jobs that Americans could have and competing against them, particularly at a time when unemployment is high and the whole thing. And so they're all going to end up having to go home, or maybe go to Britain, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, maybe Germany, something like that. And that's the kind of brain drain that I'm worried about, because I want now that's distinct from Chinese scholars or students who are associated with the People's Liberation Army that want to come study some sensitive technological matter and then take that back to their country and use it against us. And I think we should be very open about that distinction. People who want to come to this country from any country in the world, including China, that want to learn and then stay and contribute to the US economy and therefore to our economic and geopolitical strength, I think we should make it easier for that to happen rather than harder. And right now, We're making it really hard for people to do that. And like anybody else, they're going to have to seek alternatives, and those alternatives will not sometimes be good for us.
Okay, so Barbara Hicks now wants to take us back to trade and its influence. China is a major and growing trade partner for the EU and individual European countries. As with Russia, many in the EU are wary of exposure to Chinese economic influence and potential for pressure. At the same time, trade relations with the US during this administration have deteriorated. Is part of our rebuilding us strategy to balance China's power, repairing our economic, not just security relations with Europe? Do you have a sense of Chinese trade strategy with regard to Europe?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, well, the Chinese trade strategy is to deepen economic linkages, not only in trade, but also in capital flows. So be a source of capital for everything ranging from European countries to sovereign debt that the government of Italy or anybody else would like to issue, be a source of capital, which then converts into political influence, as well as, they hope, economic prosperity. And part of this One Belt, One Road infrastructure project that they've had, which really kind of extends all the way through Europe, is an effort and a recognition of the Chinese that they're not going to get to the levels of prosperity they want through their domestic demand alone or with just their traditional kind of trade partners. They want to see increased demand and for Chinese goods in a whole variety of countries, so that they can have a destination for their goods and services and therefore increase their prosperity. And Europe's we forget that when you add it up, Europe's a bigger economy even than the United States. I mean, it's a big deal over there. And so China has made, a lot of inroads over the past few years in increasing the trade and the investment linkages. And the Europeans have been very overall receptive to that. I mean, there have been lots of trade deals that have been cut back and forth and things like that. The issue for the United States, actually, I think for Europe as well, is that, when it comes to China, there's the broad phenomenon of economic linkages with China creates the potential for political coercion, but that of course works both ways. I mean, we have political coercion over China because of our relationship with them, and they have political coercion potentially over us because of their relationship with us. So some people say, well, what we really need to see is decoupling and a diversification away from China. And that's true in my mind in very particular areas, not as a general phenomenon, because the costs of our economies will be really high. And so what are we actually talking about? And here is where the Europeans will say, the Americans love to show up and say, like, don't do as much business with China, but provide no alternatives. And the perfect example of this is the 5G network across Europe and Huawei. So, now for about a year and a half or so, the U.S. government has gone around through all of its embassies and its meetings and things like that and told countries in Europe, and not just in Europe, but especially in Europe, do not allow the Chinese company Huawei to build out the infrastructure for your 5G network, because it's a security threat, because the information that travels across that network would be subject to access by China. But here's the problem. Huawei offers sort of one-stop shopping. They can build the routers, they can build the antennas, they can do the whole thing. And on average, the Huawei cost is about a third lower than if you cobble together some of the alternatives, Samsung and Ericsson and Nokia and things like that. So it's cheaper, and you can sort of do it all at once. And if you absolutely exclude Huawei from even bidding on an ability to do this, the Chinese threaten you, right? So it's like anything else in life. What's the alternative, and how much is it going to cost me? Not just monetarily, but in other ways. And what the US has done is gone around and said, okay, you cannot allow Huawei to build out your 5G network. If you can, we're going to stop sharing intelligence with you, and it's just going to be really bad. And what the Europeans really say is like, great, but like, give us an alternative. Give us an alternative to Huawei that's reasonably in the sort of same target zone of cost and things like that. And that's really what not just the US, but everybody has struggled to do. And that's the kind of thing that we're going to see more and more of, is when, you know, because you are seeing a bifurcation of the tech economies, where, you know, even TikTok, so you've got a Chinese-made app, and then suddenly non-Chinese countries are saying it's not acceptable. Huawei, it's not acceptable. ZTE, another Chinese telecom company, you know, being excluded from parts of different markets and things like that. But as there's more innovation in China, there's more startups in China. There's China has, you know, market share in different places. Right now, there's not an operating system that China produces that goes anywhere in the world, right? So, you know, you either use your smartphone, it's got iOS, or you use your, you know, whatever else, and it's running Android. But if the Chinese develop an operating system, well, what do you do then? Do you allow it? Do you exclude it? You know, what do you do? And again, it's going to be, what are the alternatives and how much do they cost, and what is the price of saying yes or no to these things? And that's really it's a more particularized approach to what we would normally call trade policy than just do or don't trade with China. I mean, we could go to any country in the world and say, we would like you not to trade with China anymore. And they would say, thank you for your interest in our economy. Now, why don't you go back to the hotel and see what's on cable, or, you know, whatever. I mean, that's not going to work. And it's something that we ourselves don't want to sign up to, because the cost to our own economy would be as great. It would be so great. So it's going to be this kind of particularized approach on particularly sensitive issues related to data privacy, national security, things like that.
So, Richard Fontaine, thank you so much for this very interesting sharing of your knowledge and experience on China-U.S. relations. We'll just have to bring you back here physically next time. But
thanks
so
for
much.
having me. I am willing to make the sacrificial trip to Sarasota for the good of my country and for the importance of our national security. I'm willing to do that when both the pandemic and the water temperatures provide. So, but anyway, no, thank you. Thanks for having me. This has been a lot of fun. I hope you guys got something out of this talk, and I look forward to staying.
It was wonderful, right? It was really good.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.